Did you know that you make 35,000 decisions every day? It's true. You do. You start when you wake up in the morning. You reach for what is most important to you. Now, for many of us, we reach for our phones. That's a decision. We decide if we're going to brush our teeth or jump into the shower first. We reach for a cup to have a glass of water. Usually, we go back to the same cup over and over. We decide if we're going to put on our right shoe or our left shoe before we head out the door. All of those are decisions that each of us make every single day. We decide which way we are going to leave our neighborhood, if we're going to stop for coffee, what we're going to eat for lunch. We continually make decisions every day. When somebody cuts us off in transit, on the sidewalk, or in traffic, we make a decision on how we are going to react. We continually make decisions all day long on what we're going to say, and even more importantly, how we are going to say it. And all of those 35,000 decisions that each of us make every single day start to form our habits, and our habits shape our lives. Now, we are in the middle of a summer series called Becoming Me, where we're taking a look at 9 ancient habits that God has designed for us to use in our lives to live our best lives. And over the last several weeks, you have heard from many of our staff as they've talked about some of those habits. We've talked about Sabbath, we've talked about gratitude, we've talked about prayer, and then last week we talked about worship. Today, I'm very excited to introduce to you somebody that many of you already know, and that's Pastor Dan. Now, Pastor Dan oversees outreach here at One Church TO, and that oversees all our Love Local and our Love Global work that happens in our city and around the world. It also includes our food bank that we run here at One Church TO, that we see 500 individuals every single week show up, which represents about 1,500 plus individuals every week that our food bank is serving. Now, Pastor Dan, he chooses to live his life with intention. He gives great thought to the work that he leads here at One Church TO, so I know that you're really going to enjoy what he has to say. Let's take a look together.
So there I was, Valentine's Day evening in my early 20s, walking into work with just another close shift ahead of me at Starbucks. But I remembered as I was walking through the door, this was the day I was going to meet my new manager. So I asked my buddy Aaron when I walked through the door, "Hey, where's the new manager?" He said he's been in the men's washroom for the past hour and he's waiting for you. Awkward, right? Anyways, I knocked on the washroom door and this new manager tells me, "Hey, come on in." There he was, and I can picture this like it was yesterday. This guy was on his hands and knees scrubbing the washroom grout lines with a toothbrush. Yes, a toothbrush. And for those of you who don't know what grout lines are, you're probably like me and don't see any reason to clean them. He looked at me and said, "If it doesn't look new, it isn't clean." This was my first impression of this stranger. He was setting an example of what serving this store would look like for me and the rest of the staff. I find myself going back to that moment and that manager because I got to know him pretty well over the next few years. We worked together and I saw him serve the staff, guests, and the neighborhood with such a genuine care for people. So here's why I told you that story. That experience and other experiences in my life have helped shape and are still shaping the person I'm becoming. And if you're just joining us for this summer series, we've been using the life experiences of some of our staff team to give you a glimpse of how Jesus has influenced how we live our lives today. The title of this talk is Becoming the Most Important Person in the Room. And there's a scene in the Bible where Jesus explains how to become that exact person. Here's that story. Then they began to argue among themselves, his first followers, about who would be the greatest among them. Jesus told them, "In this world, the kings and great men lord it over their people, yet they are called friends of the people. But among you it will be different. Those who are the greatest among you should take the lowest rank, and the leader should be like a servant. Who is the most important? The one who sits at the table or the one who serves? The one who sits at the table, of course, but not here, for I am among you as the one who serves. Jesus has completely redefined status. He says the leader should be like a servant. He's telling his followers that even though he is God, he has taken on the status of a servant, because that is how we become the most important person in the room. Can you imagine this defined our society? If leaders from all sectors of life, family, political, religious, educational, became the most important person in the room by being the one who serves. That means we are all modeling the life of Jesus. We walk into a room, a situation, a friend, a family dispute, asking ourselves, how do I serve this moment? But before we keep going, we have to figure out what Jesus meant when he said, among you, it will be different. Among you, it will be different. And that you refers to anyone who considers themselves a Christ follower. That suggests to me that Christ followers have to have a distinct motivation and characteristics when it comes to serving people and situations. So here's what I do. I do a lot of thinking about volunteering versus serving. You might be thinking, well, aren't they the same? Essentially, yeah, they are. A quick Google search defines volunteering as freely offering to do something. So in essence, volunteering does have this genuine intention to help others. But I also think volunteering has its limits. Where serving, the way Jesus mentioned, where he said it will be different, it adds a few layers. Here's how we see the subtle differences play out. Now try to think of your experiences when you hear the two. Volunteering says, what can I get out of this? But serving says, what can I give to this? Volunteering says, I need this so I can get. But serving says, I want to give this so I can point to God. Volunteering says, I feel happy when I help. But serving says, I experience joy when I sacrifice. Volunteering says, I'm doing this so I'm owed this. Serving says, I'm doing this because Jesus did this for me. Volunteering may be our human attempt to do what is right when helping others. And I want to emphasize that there's absolutely nothing wrong with this. It's our human nature, but I think it's actually that. Our human nature is what limits us. Here's what I mean by that. Our human nature naturally has an instinct to survive, but as Christ followers in Matthew 10:39, we're noted as losing our life in order to find it. This is where serving takes on a whole other realm of selfless service that requires nothing in return or no recognition. So I'm a parent of 2 young boys, and one of the core ideas I want to pass down to them is expecting nothing in return when they serve. So here's how simple I want it to be for them. I want them to bring their own snacks, their own water, whatever drink they want to the place they're serving. You might be thinking, well, why? Well, because I want the kids to serve with nothing intended apart from giving their time, their resources, and their skills. Of course, if it's somebody that's offering them the snack, I'm going to say, yeah, take it. But my heart hears that there's no expectation of what I'm getting out of this. This becoming me idea is rooted in a core belief from Matthew 6, where Jesus is explaining that when you give to the needy, pray and fast that you shouldn't make it about yourself. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. Jesus is obviously exaggerating reality here to make a point. He did this quite often. It's impossible that your right hand doesn't know what your left hand is doing. And at that time, Jesus was likely calling out some of the religious leaders who were boasting about their service to others. But he's probably calling out you and me as well. Double checking if our motivation to serve is in the right place is a good start. I've got to do this on a regular basis. especially in my marriage. So I've been married for 7 years, and whether you're married, not married, in a relationship, not in a relationship, I think all of us have been in some kind of serving relationship. Let's say with a parent or a friend, where you kind of keep track what you've done for them. And I'll be the first to admit that I'm serving my wife and making sure she knows it. So much so, I've made lists, mental ones of course, of where I've served the kids more than her or our house more than her. And I've even manually created charts outlining the comparative number of hours served to our household duties. Of course, I've stopped doing this because I got in a lot of trouble, but you could see where my motivation went off track. So I have to ask myself constantly, how do I serve this moment? With the add-on of not looking for recognition. So let's transition a bit here from our lived experience and take a closer look at how Jesus' lived experience helped us become the most important person in the room. Jesus said serving will look different as a follower of Christ, something that has more depth than the way I described volunteering earlier. I want to revisit the story I mentioned earlier where Jesus identifies who is the most important person in the room. Jesus, being God, didn't really need to serve. In reality, the norm would have been others served him. Watch this short clip from the Bible Project that helps explain how radical it was for Jesus to serve the way he did.
We have to turn to the story of Jesus. His earliest followers called him the firstborn of all creation.
The firstborn of creation. What does that mean?
It's a statement that describes his status. In the New Testament, Jesus is portrayed as God become human, the eternal Son of God who brought creation into being and has all authority.
So if anyone deserves the ultimate birthright, it's Jesus.
Yes, and Jesus did claim that God's royal power was arriving in a new way through himself, but it was power redefined.
Yeah, Jesus said that if you want to be first, you need to become last.
And he said that people with real authority are those who serve. In fact, this redefinition of power is explored in an early Christian poem about Jesus.
While he was in his very nature God, he didn't exploit his equality with God for self-advantage. Rather, he emptied himself of status and power and became a servant.
Jesus joined the poor and served them. And instead of fighting his rivals, he served them too. Jesus showed that true power is displayed through self-giving love.
Jesus was so radical in his approach. He didn't fight his rivals, he served them. You may have seen in that video someone washing another person's feet. This is Jesus doing something his early followers never could have imagined, a master washing a servant's feet. So was it the feet washing that made Jesus so radically different? I'd say it was intended to point to Jesus' ultimate sacrifice, his crucifixion and separation from God. The sacrifice he explained to Simon Peter when he said, "You don't understand now what I'm doing, but someday you will." So like any attribute of God, you can find so many examples of the writers and characters in the biblical text that point to this radical nature of serving like Jesus did. They all describe Jesus' sacrificial nature. 1 Peter says this, "Each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others, as a faithful steward of God's grace in its various forms. If anyone speaks, they should do as one who speaks the very words of God. If anyone serves, they should do so with the strength of God, so that in all things God may be praised through Jesus Christ." Philippians 2:3 says this, "Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves." The Bible Project video referenced a poem in Philippians 2, which is a game changer when it comes to how Jesus served, but more importantly, who he served. So take note of how and who he served in this poem. Though he was God, he did not think of equality with God as something to cling to. Instead, he gave up his divine privileges. He took the humble position of a slave and was born as a human being. When he appeared in human form, he humbled himself in obedience to God and died a criminal's death on a cross. So that means the only way we can become like Jesus and serve like he did Our human nature has to daily transform into a humble lifestyle that is obedient to God. Jesus was able to serve the people around him because he was doing this in obedience to God. That tells me my service to others happens through this manner. God defines my view of how others and situations look like, not how I see them. It reiterates that the human nature will be flawed in some way, but like Jesus, we have to be connected to God's view. So here's a short story that may help us here. So I just turned 40 this month. I know, shocking. I had my eyes checked out, and my corrective lenses have not really changed since I was 12. I did the typical eye exam behind the different lenses while trying to read letters on the wall. Apparently, my corrective lenses needed to be adjusted a bit. Plus, I have a slight astigmatism, something to do with the curvature of my eyes. All that said, I need a new prescription for my lenses. And the eye doctor said this: you're going to see things a lot more clear, a lot more sharper. That's God's lens allowing us to see other people's perspectives and their need. For example, a person's physical need might not just end there, but our obedience to God allows his light to uncover emotional or spiritual need that might be hiding behind that physical need. It's my daily obedience, it's your daily obedience to humble ourselves like Christ and serve others just like he did. I honestly believe the Spirit of God will take us into crevices of people's hearts so we can serve others unconditionally. And that's a hard road to go down. It requires us to be patient, kind, speak truth in love, and reflect on every aspect of God's love. But that's the daily grind of becoming more like Jesus and actively learning to live like him. You know, the terms I mentioned before, volunteering and serving, they're just descriptors trying to point to what's essential, becoming more and more like Jesus. But the distinction helps me because volunteering shows me how I want to help others. But serving points me to Jesus' humility in me, making me more like him, transforming the way I see others and allowing me to serve others like he did. All right, so now what do? How do I serve instead of volunteering? How do I put God's lens to see others and serve like Jesus did? There has to be this convergence of your life, your relationships, work, friends, family, marriage, children, all your networks, neighbors, school, sports teams. And there has to be this convergence with the way Jesus served others, like his family, his disciples, the people that hated him, the people that wanted him dead, the strangers that approached him. Now here's the challenge. All of those people and situations have to be seen through the lens of God so that we can serve each other uniquely, every relationship, every situation, the way Jesus would. Hard, I know, but Jesus does promise his Holy Spirit to be with us. So that requires a daily dose of humility and obedience to God's way of doing things. I love the title of this series because it tells us that we're never a finished version of ourselves, that there's always the need as Christ followers to become more like Jesus, actively learning to live like him. Remember that store manager in the beginning, the one who was scrubbing the grout lines the first day I met him? As I got to know him, I discovered he was committed to his Jewish faith. And because of that commitment, he served God and was able to serve joyfully the people and situations around him. So doing life with people and serving the way Jesus did makes life messy as those unclean grout lines. It's a lived experience that each of us have to take on with every interaction. Doing life for me happens primarily in my neighborhood, with the people who live on my street, the local grocery store, my kids' school, their friends, their parents, the community center, and even the park that I'm in right now. The stranger who passes me by, someone who doesn't look, act, or believe what I believe. These are the people and places I do life with. My hope every day is that through my actions and words, I'm pointing them to the hope and peace that I found in God. Nothing more and nothing less. So, who are you doing life with? The network of people, places that are your people and your places only. What I want to leave you today with is a perspective shift, where you ask yourself, how does God see this person or situation? And how can I serve this moment? That perspective shift can only happen by our humility and obedience to God and To serve like Jesus means to expect nothing in return, no recognition. Jesus said to his first followers, and he's saying it to you and I today, among you it will be different. So let's serve and be unignorably good.
Well, thanks, Pastor Dan. That was fantastic. You know what, as you were teaching and as we were preparing for this, I couldn't help but start to think back on my own life and people who have modeled this really well for me. I know I've shared in the past that I grew up in a small church community that served me very, very well, but I was actually thinking about the neighbors who lived across the road when I was growing up as you were teaching. You see, I had these really special neighbors. Their names were Mr. and Mrs. Brad, and they were in their 60s, their late 60s. They were retired, and so every morning before we left for school, what would happen is Mr. Brad would roll up his garage door, and Mrs. Brad would open up her front door, and you could see right through her house. And as we went to school, they would wave us off and wish us a good day. And then when we came home from school, they would be sitting there on their porch and in their garage, welcoming us back home for the day. And the best part of living on my street was that we were allowed to actually go over to Mr. and Mrs. Brad's house. And so we could go there whenever we wanted. And Mr. Brad, he had this amazing garage. He was a collector. And so he collected all sorts of things. It was very organized. And we were able to go into his garage. And he had a tool for everything. And so he would tune our bikes. He would fix the toys that we had broken. He would fix things that we had broken in the neighborhood before someone could discover that we had done that. We would spend so many hours on Mrs. Brad's porch, and we'd be talking about life and what had happened at school and the problems that we had at school. And you know what? Now as a child, I could never understand what they were doing. They were just Mr. and Mrs. Brad on our street. But looking back, I can see that they were serving us, and they were serving us well. They were offering their time, their talents, all of them, really. That was the best part of living on our street, that we could go over there at any point, and they served us and our neighborhood so very well. They modeled this for me before I even know what it meant to serve. And I love that list that you had that was contrasting volunteering compared to serving. Maybe what is that distinction? If we had to Coles Notes it, why is this distinction so important that we get right, especially if we call ourselves followers of Jesus?
Yeah. Funny, I get a lot of grief for this because people are like, it's the same thing, Dan. Why do you have to belabor this point? But for me, I see volunteering, it's just a term. I mentioned that. And it's just something I see sometimes in my lived experience, that you just kind of jump in, you do your deed, and then you come out. And then you might not think about what you did. I had to do it for school. If you're a high school student, you got to get those 40 hours. And then I was talking about serving has this other layer, and I'm looking across this room. It's so unique to you. Mm-hmm. Your story was very unique to you. It's your own street. Yep. It's Mr. and Mrs. Brad, and serving is unique to you. And that's why I was saying there are these other layers to it. It's unique to the people that are in your life, the places that are in your life. So there is this investment, and I want to make it less about the actual physical doing. There's also this layer of, I had this example of when you're talking to somebody. Are you actually listening to them? And then here's where maybe serving takes that extra layer with Jesus, is that you remember what they said the week after or the day after, and you're actually responding. Your preferences may be lowered. Maybe your attitude in that conversation is now a serving attitude. So that's a little bit of the distinction. I want to make this clear too. Volunteering is so important. I know a volunteer firefighter. I know volunteer doctors. Yeah. The term means nothing to me. It's more so the intention behind serving.
Now, you had told me a story about how you served your wife. You gonna tell us that story? Because that was a good story.
Oh, that story, yeah. This is terrible. This is perfect. I was putting down these things called paver stones, and as I was doing it, I screwed up. And I'm like, I hope Hillary doesn't come out here. She came out here. She saw it. She's like, are you supposed to be doing it that way? I had to take everything off, start again, and everything in me didn't want to admit that she was right. It took me 2 weeks to finally admit that she was right. And I know that doesn't seem like, that's not serving. In reality, it actually took me 2 weeks to drop my pride and say she was right. So, yeah.
I've never been in that situation,
no.
But I'm glad that you learned a lesson there.
Nice,
yeah, that's
you're
really
not,
good.
You're not honest with yourself.
No. You know what? It's so It's so easy for us to go and serve a moment, isn't it? To show up and check a box and serve a moment, or be like, oh, in this moment I'm going to serve someone. It's much more difficult to take on the posture of serving in our lives, that I'm going to serve the people around me. And as followers of Jesus, if you call yourself a follower of Jesus, this is the call that God gives to us, that he would be able to use our lives to share his love with the world around us. See, God invites us to see people differently. Kind of, you said that about putting on the lens of God, and that allows us to see people in a whole different light, and my role in their lives in a whole different light. This is kind of how we obey God, right? Like, it's a little bit less about even the people in front of me and more about obedience, that I'm willing to put myself in a posture that I'm going to serve in whatever area, wherever God has planted me for that moment, not when I have the tag of serving.
Yeah. I had a similar story to Jessica just this past week, and I asked the person if I could share this, because I was looking for a story. We've been preparing for the last couple of months, and I'm like, I got to find something that just encapsulates the perfect way to talk about this talk. And so I met with her last Monday, and if you know this person, she is the most selfless, caring, and she's going through chronic pain right now. Has to use an aid to walk, and we met for coffee, 7 a.m. I love that she's a morning person. And she's telling me she felt useless. And I was like, there's no way you feel useless. And so she was recounting some of the stories that she had gone through, part of the chronic pain. And she didn't even notice the times that she was actually helping other people, strangers. And I don't expect this of everybody, but you could see her personality lends to this. She loves talking to people, and I love it too. And as we were leaving, I asked her specifically, do you need help getting to your car? She's like, no, I know you got to go pick up your kids and take them somewhere. I'm like, oh, thanks. And I heard her behind me talking to a person that you could see obviously needed help. And she asked him this, and said, what are you looking for today? And that just stuck with me on the ride home. She wasn't looking to just give a handout or anything like that. She was looking for an interaction. How could she serve in that moment?
Wow.
Yeah.
That's really cool. I love also that when you told me that story, you were serving, right? Like, you were willing to pause your day and your time to go meet with someone just to give them some of your time. And in doing so, you're serving her and she's serving you. And what a beautiful picture of how God has designed the world to work, right? How God has designed especially his followers to work. Now, you lead a pretty incredible team here at One Church TO. And we've actually been spending significant time over this past year really learning about how to serve the neighborhood that really surrounds One Church TO. And our heart, as we engaged in this process, was to find out what the Holy Spirit is already up to in our neighborhood, and then see how we could meet some of the needs that he was identifying for us. I wonder, could you maybe give us kind of bird's eye view of what we've been doing this past year and what we're learning?
Yeah, of course. I'm a visual learner, so we're going to get something up here to help us all. So Pastor Jessica mentioned in the past 8 months, we were working with an amazing group of, there's 20 of you here, and then some of you joined online as well. And we went through this process of, like you said, we were trying to get to know the felt needs of our neighborhood, not assume what was going on in the neighborhood. We wanted to hear what they were saying. So we started with the community assets. So basically, we went out to our neighborhood. We actually have a catchment. We defined our borders. It was from Steeles Avenue to the 401, from Midland to about Vic Park. So we said, there's about 100,000 people in this area. Let's go see what the pulse is. So this team of 20 went out, and this is before they actually went through 8 weeks. It was a grind. They went through 8 classes to learn how Jesus worked with marginalized communities. So then we went out with the most important part, getting to hear from our community. And they did interviews on the street. They did interviews with our food bank that was captured as well in this beautiful circle is here. We had one specific young adult, and I know she'll punch me in my face if I say who her name is, but she did amazing. She did a lot of the census data research. We got a lot of stuff. And if you don't remember, you actually helped in winter. If you remember, you did a survey to share how you experience working with individuals that are marginalized. And we got a lot of that information. So this was the beautiful part we were looking for. What is One Church TO's unique contribution to this neighborhood? We have a felt need, and we have One Church TO. how do they come together to serve our community? So that was, in a nutshell, what we've been doing for the past 8 months.
Okay, so we learned all this. This looks really neat. This was months and months of research and going into the community. And I love what you said. We did a class before anything even started to learn about the theology behind it, why we were actually going to go through this process. So what did we actually learn? Like, what did we discover were the felt needs, I guess?
Yeah, the data made sense in the sense that we found 4 focus areas that we want to help coming in the fall. So English as a second language, you might hear that as ESL, employment support, parent and young child support, and the community was our neighborhood is looking for space. Look at this building.
Yeah.
So we thought, wow, we've got a lot of space. So we said to ourselves, how are we going to approach this in the fall? So the nuts and bolts are turning right now. We're figuring stuff out. So look out in the fall for opportunities to help out that way as well.
Yeah, we're really excited about this fall. Some of the stuff that we've learned you're gonna start hearing about over the next few weeks, and ways that you can get involved and ways that you can offer it to the community around you. Now, the second thing we learned though was we learned a little bit about ourselves, right? Where we lived, what was going on there. So maybe tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So we talked if you can remember the survey, there were actually 275 of you that put up your hand. Many of you said, we actually want to take another step into our neighborhoods. So we found 2 focus areas, actually. This is the church. This is One Church TO.
Okay.
We found 2 focus areas here where actually many of you live, close to 275 of you. And so we're going to use that same approach, going forward. Maybe not this fall, but in 2025, we're going to use that same approach where we find out what the felt needs are in those 2 focus areas. And then if you expand out a bit more, we can see the individual responses. This is dreaming, and this is my heart, and this is why I get so passionate about this brand, so to say, of serving. There's a lot of these clusters. These are all specific respondents. You responded here. And we're hoping that you as clusters, maybe all the way up here, my geography is not the best, but I'm going to say this is Oshawa.
Okay, yeah.
So let's
we
say
got
this.
the church over there. Like, you can see it pretty.
Sure.
Yeah.
This is the church. Let's just say this is Oshawa.
Okay, yeah.
So our heart is then to actually group those people in those clusters and say, hey, let's find out the felt need in your community and let's start serving with some intention. So that was the heart around the data, all this work, because we want to get on the ground and serve like Jesus did.
I love this picture. It's really the love army in action, isn't it? Us serving at One Church TO and in the places that God has planted us in. It's a really beautiful picture because it represents really millions of opportunities for us to serve. This picture represents thousands for sure, of coffee shops, schools, bus stops, sidewalks, all sorts, libraries, parks, malls, dog parks, all these different places that each of us are given opportunity to be in every single day, and opportunities for us to embrace the call. What would it look like, friends, if we really decided to serve those who are around us the way that God has called us to? You know what Paul writes in Galatians 5? He says this: serve one another in love, for the whole law can be summed up in this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. You see, God has designed serving to be his extension of love to our world. And as we approach it less of a checkbox and more of a posture of life, that's how he is able to take that love and extend it to the world and the communities around us. You know what? As we close today, I'm going to invite you to stand online in the room. And Pastor Dan, I wonder if you could pray over us as a community as we step into this. Maybe ask God if he would give us his eyes, like you talked about, his lens, to see the communities around us and these millions of opportunities that each of us have every single day to serve those around us.
Sure, and I'm going to start with a prayer that was prayed for decades. So find yourself in this prayer and with your networks and the places that are around you. Lord, make us instruments of your peace. Where there's hatred, let us sow love. Where there's injury, forgiveness. Where there's doubt, faith. Where there's despair, hope. Where there's darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. Grant us that we may not look to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in the giving that we receive, it is in the forgiving that we are pardoned, and it is in the dying that we are born to eternal life. So friends, as Christ followers, we look to Jesus' example of serving, seeing others through your lens and looking for no recognition. Jesus, plant your hope in each of us every day, every place, every situation, every interaction, so that we can point others to your grace and your eternal hope. In Jesus' name, amen.